Committee on Housing, Transportation, and Community Development will come to order. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is about fixing the problems that Americans encounter every day. It represents the largest long-term investment in our nation's infrastructure and competitiveness in a generation, and it is also going to create millions of good-paying jobs with benefits. Just as important, it will make a direct and immediate impact on the lives of Americans. It's exactly the kind of thing that Washington ought to be spending time on, and exactly the kind of thing that we came to the Senate to get done. So today's hearing will focus on how the Infrastructure and Jobs Act is supporting transit in small cities and rural areas, and how we can make sure that it works. In June of 2021, this subcommittee convened a bipartisan hearing to highlight the transit needs in rural communities. And we had excellent testimony from leaders from Minnesota, South Dakota, and Native communities as well. That hearing helped us to understand the issues facing rural transit providers, including how rural and tribal formula grant programs need funding boosts in order to meet the changing needs of their communities. We also held a hearing in Minnesota last summer to understand the transit needs in our state, my state. And I heard from cities like Rochester about their use of competitive transit grants to expand bus service and support projects like the Destination Medical Center. In August of this last year, the Senate passed the historic Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which boosted annual funding for rural transit. To give you an idea, this law is the largest investment in transit in a generation. In the first year of this new law, transit formula grants will jump 30% and continue to grow after that. This is an incredible opportunity for transit in small cities and rural places all over America. So now we turn to implementation. Our committee's job is to provide oversight and to make sure that this historic investment is working as Congress intended. Already, the Federal Transit Administration has gone to work to cut through red tape and to get funding out to communities as quickly as possible. In fact, the FTA announced just today that this year, my home state of Minnesota will receive $166 million in transit funds through the formula programs. The FTA also recently issued something called a NOFO, or Notice of Funding Availability, for 2 bus grant programs that simplified the paperwork transit agencies are required to fill out. Now, this is important. This will make these grants more accessible for smaller operators who honestly don't have huge grant writing teams or even any grant writing teams on staff some of the time. The FTA has also held dozens of webinars and calls with transit agencies to provide technical support and to answer questions about the exciting opportunities that are available under this new law. So today, we want to hear from our panel about the impact of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act will have on transit in small cities and rural places. We want to know what implementation issues we should keep an eye on and how this committee and the federal government can help support local creativity and innovation in rural transit. Here's just one example. During the pandemic, Minnesota transit systems innovated and served as a lifeline for families. Minnesota was one of the first states to use transit to bring vaccines home to people. TRICAP, which serves the 5-county area around St. Cloud, provided reverse transit, bringing medications and other necessities to people, especially the elderly who wouldn't have been able to access them otherwise. This is the type of innovation that smaller transit operators can do, and we ought to be thinking about how we in Congress can support this kind of work. So rural and small city transit systems are leading the way, innovating with on-demand service, specialized routes, and routes that connect people to specific destinations. Today, we're going to have a chance to learn how this is going and how the Infrastructure and Jobs Act can support this innovation. As we listen to the panel of rural transit leaders today, I ask you to keep in mind the veteran who needs to get to a VA clinic, or the person who's trying to get back on their feet by completing job training, or a senior who is looking forward to their weekly fresh produce delivery. 3 years ago, Senator Rounds and I teamed up with Senator Fischbach from Nebraska and Senator Baldwin from Wisconsin to create the Rural Economy Working Group. And our goal was to highlight the strengths and assets in diverse rural communities and to learn from our rural leaders about how the federal government can be a better partner, a good partner in supporting their leadership. We know that small cities and towns and rural places produce our food and energy and are hubs of manufacturing and entrepreneurship, education, healthcare, arts, culture. And we need these communities to work for everyone, and that means transportation has to work. And for transportation to work, we need to see viable, efficient, well-functioning transit systems, buses, paratransit, and on-demand services, to name a few. And now, with the rising gas prices caused by this terrible and brutal invasion of Ukraine by Putin, we can see how important it is to move rapidly to clean energy and renewable fuels. When it comes to clean energy, the United States can lead, or we can follow, and I want us to lead. I also want to see opportunities for electric vehicles and low-carbon renewables like ethanol and biodiesel, which is so important in Minnesota, to be available in greater Minnesota and in rural places all over America. The fact is, rural transit providers are full of great ideas for how to meet the needs of communities when it comes to mobility, and we need to listen. So I look forward to our witnesses today from hearing about how the federal government can be a good partner in delivering on the promise of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill in smaller cities and rural areas. And I want to thank Senator Rounds and his staff for working with us on this important hearing and for his partnership on all these issues. Thank you, Senator Rounds, and I recognize you now for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and most certainly we appreciate the opportunity to work with you in addressing rural issues, and in particular, this is one that I think affects our states in the Midwest, just as it does states throughout the country, but very important that we address this and we make sure that the dollars are spent in an appropriate fashion. I want to begin by also thanking our witnesses for taking the time to attend today's hearing and to share their expertise with us. Last year, President Biden signed into law the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which allocated an unprecedented amount of taxpayer dollars to transit systems across the country. This law provided a 67% increase in annual federal funding for public transportation when compared to the annual amount provided in the previous authorization. This is not including the $69.5 billion for transit in the response to COVID-19, nor the $340 million provided through the Public Transportation Relief Program. Now, of the $108 billion authorized and appropriated through the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, for public transportation, it is important to note that just $4.56 billion was allocated for the Rural Formula Program. All the while, states like New York and California are estimated to receive $11 billion and $10 billion respectively. With this investment comes a need for critical oversight to make certain that this money is spent on fixes that will make the most impact. Therefore, as we move to implement this legislation, it is important to discuss the challenges facing rural communities in offering safe, affordable, and reliable methods of transportation. Rural areas cover 97% of U.S. land area, and most rural residents still rely on their own vehicles as their main means of transportation. Overall, rural residents travel about 33% more, rural workers travel 38% more, and lower-income rural workers 59% more annual miles than those in urban areas. Rural residents spend more time and money on transportation and are more vulnerable to transportation problems like vehicle maintenance issues. They lose their ability to drive, or fuel prices spike as they have right now. Therefore, rural roads are heavily traveled and critical for maintaining the way of life in South Dakota and the rest of rural America. The frequency of travel on some of these rural roads has further increased over the past years as tourism has become a growing business in the rural U.S. Most of the country's national parks are located in rural regions, like Mount Rushmore in South Dakota, which draws a large number of visitors each year. In addition, with agriculture dominating most rural communities, much of the nation's food industry relies on the transportation of products over long distances on rural roads and highways. The safety and structural integrity of these roads is important to maintain an interconnected transportation system. With few communities in South Dakota having an actual fixed route bus system, a majority of rural transit offerings are modes of paratransit, which provide transportation for the elderly and/or persons with disabilities. Roughly 31% of the populations in rural communities are either elderly or disabled, and these two demographics within a community often need transportation services for doctor's appointments or to complete grocery shopping. Due to the need to travel long distances, driver shortages, and lower ridership, providing on-demand rides in rural areas can be extremely expensive. As we implement the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, I think we should explore ways to utilize public-private partnerships to make local, state, and federal dollars go further. We should also be looking at new ways to use technology. Just as an example, in the Sioux Falls, South Dakota, the Sioux Area Metro, known as SAM, is trying out a SAM on-demand phone app, which allows riders to request rides on their smartphones to increase ridership and efficiency. During implementation of the infrastructure law, it is also critical to reduce the regulatory burden as much as possible for the truly small communities around the country. In South Dakota and in rural Minnesota, our rural transit agencies servicing small towns do not have the capacity to wade through endless red tape. Rural communities must have the freedom to use the funding in ways that serve them, not be forced into a one-size-fits-all approach. To manage these issues, resources must be allocated to the most vital areas of the transport system, and I think our subcommittee should remain focused on the oversight of those resources. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and learning more about ways rural America can best utilize the resources of the infrastructure law. And I would simply close by thanking our chairman for having this meeting today. I think it's important that we start out on the right area and focus appropriately on the funding that is available and where it is going to. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. I'm now going to introduce our witnesses. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'll introduce all three of you and then turn to each of you in turn to make your opening statements. Ryan Daniel is the Chief Executive Officer of St. Cloud Metrobus in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Mr. Daniel also serves as President of the Minnesota Public Transit Association. And I'd like to note that he is accompanied today by St. Cloud Mayor Dave Kleiss. It's good to see you, Mayor. And also Minnesota Valley Transit Authority Luther Winder. Thank you for being with us. Scott Bogren is the Executive Director of the Community Transportation Association of America. Thank you very much for being with us. And Bart Fegenbaum is a Senior Managing Director for Transportation Policy at the Reason Foundation. Welcome, and thank you all for being with us today, and we look forward to your testimony. You may each begin, before you begin your opening statements, just a few reminders. For witnesses, you will have 5 minutes for your opening statements. Your full written statement will be made part of the record. And for witnesses and senators in the hearing room, the light in front of you, as you know, will turn yellow when you have a 1 minute remaining and red when your time is up. I'm sure we'll be able to manage with our time constraints. Thank you very much, and I'll turn now to our first witness.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for this opportunity to testify regarding the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and its impact on smaller transit systems. I am testifying today as Chief Executive Officer of St. Cloud Metrobus and also as President of the Minnesota Public Transit Association, which includes transit systems throughout the state, urban, suburban, and rural. First, I would like to express our deep appreciation for the increased funding provided in the IIJA law. The 30% increase in formula funds, as well as for programs like the bus and bus facility program, will make a huge difference as transit systems continue to rebuild and serve a growing number of riders in the wake of the pandemic. The impact of this law for St. Cloud Metrobus and other transit systems will be expanded, higher quality transit service over the next 5 years. Knowing the level of funding we will have allows all transit systems to plan efficiently and allows us to provide stable bus service to our customers. I would also like to thank the Federal Transit Administration for its work in communicating with transit systems and working hard to get the money delivered as quickly as possible. Many of the transit system managers in Minnesota have participated in webinars and had questions answered by the detailed information provided by the FTA. The Notice of Funding Opportunity issued for the No Low Emission Bus Program allows transit systems the opportunity to apply for funds that will expand their fleets while protecting the environment. Metrobus has been transitioning our fleet to low emissions CNG since 2014. We are proud to say we are now 90% CNG. With additional funding opportunities such as the No Low Emission Program. In the next 5 years, our organization is planning to apply for funds to replace a large majority of our first CNG bus fleet, which will reach its useful life in 2026. According to the American Public Transit Association's calculation, we will be getting additional formula funds. With this increase in funds, Metrobus will be in a better position to attract safe, reliable transit operators, allowing us to maintain and possibly expand our service, as well as keep up with technological advances in the industry and the overall workforce moving into a new post-pandemic world. In rural areas of Minnesota, residents who ride our buses often have no other option for getting to important medical appointments, jobs, school, family events, and to access services. For example, Betty in Worthington uses community transit to get to medical appointments, the hair salon, and weekly shopping trips. Without this bus service, she will have a hard time living in her own home and will probably need to leave her community to live in a larger city that had transit service available. Unfortunately, community transit has limited service hours and capacity to meet all of the needs of residents in the 9-county service area that it covers. We appreciate the focus of IIJA on providing resources to underserved areas. Smaller communities struggle to pay for weekend or evening service, but residents need to get to important destinations after 4 or 5 in the afternoon. As decisions are made about allocating discretionary dollars provided through the IIJA, we urged FTA to follow through on prioritizing areas that currently leave many people without the level of transit service they need. Rural communities also struggle to generate funding to meet local match requirements to access state and federal funds. We applaud your work, Madam Chair, along with Senator Rounds, to pass the Investments in Rural Transit Act to reduce the need to charge local residents more in order to access additional transit resources in areas with lower densities and lower incomes. The new law's focus on modernizing the fleet is very important. Many of our systems in Minnesota find themselves running buses with over 250,000 miles due to difficulties in purchasing new buses. As systems struggle to keep older vehicles operating, the maintenance costs increase while dependability decreases. Any assistance that can be provided in helping systems purchase new vehicles will make a big difference in the impact that the IIJA will have in short term in improving transit service. Another important issue for smaller transit systems in the implementation of this law is the technical assistance. Rural systems with a small number of staff have a hard time dealing with new reporting or planning requirements and developing funded applications without some additional technical assistance. Some systems in Minnesota have been successful in securing competitive funding for new buses or facilities in the past, but most systems are stretched thin and do not have the capacity to carefully track all funding opportunities and effectively compete for new funding. Any resources that can be provided to help smaller systems apply for a variety of funding sources will be greatly appreciated. The additional stable funding provided by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act will allow smaller transit systems to plan and deliver more frequent, higher quality bus service to more residents and more communities. As the new law is implemented, we urge federal agencies to focus on better service for communities with little to no service and to work closely with smaller transit systems to reduce the burden of regulations, reporting requirements, matching funding requirements, and the level of work needed to apply for discretionary federal transportation funds. Investing in the mobility of rural residents will provide a strong return as people are able to remain in their own homes, living independent, productive lives, and contributing to the local communities. Madam Chair, I thank you for your time.
Chairwoman Smith and Ranking Member Rounds, really appreciate the chance to be here today to speak with you about rural small urban, tribal, and specialized transportation. My organization, the Community Transportation Association, we have about 1,200 members around the country, and that's where they come from. And it's really great to hear that both of you really recognize what rural transit systems look like. They are not scaled-down versions of WMATA here or the LA Metro. They are unique systems that are serving very unique communities, and oftentimes, I think, as you've rightfully shown, working with an on-demand type of service. Our written testimony goes into a lot of, I think, opportunities when it comes to the bipartisan infrastructure law and things to kind of keep an eye on when we're looking at the implementation. I just want to cover a few here in my remarks. One thing is the non-federal share. Our rural, tribal, small cities often use federal formula funds to operate. They're allowed to do that, but that requires a 50-50 match between federal and non-federal. And coming out of a pandemic that's had pretty rough economic consequences in rural America, and then on top of that, the increases in rural transit funding that we're grateful for, it puts a lot of pressure on these systems to be able to match these funds. I've even had some of my members talk about they're operating aging vehicles. They see the funding that's put in place now to put new fleets out, and they're not competing because they don't have the local match to compete. Another one is equitable access to the competitive grants that are there. The new law has a number of competitive grant programs. We're probably all, and you were mentioning the bus and low-no NOFA because kind of that's the first thing that's happened with the bipartisan infrastructure law. Small agencies need that set aside. The Bus and Bus Facilities Program has a 15% set aside for rural communities. And that's important because, as both of you are well aware, they don't have the capacity to compete with major metropolitan areas. A lot of CTA's members, in the last 6 months, the general manager, I'd try to call and they'd say, she's out driving today. You wear a lot of hats in rural systems, and so they need to be competing with other systems that are the same size, and that's really important. Overall, our members operate vehicles and buses, so to see the kind of investment we see in that NOFA for those types of vehicles, the workhorses of public transit around the country was just wonderful to see. Also within that NOFA, two things I wanted to point to. One was the Federal Transit Administration has done a great job of engaging with smaller agencies to make sure that though they may require fleet transition plans for systems as they move towards the low and no emission vehicles, though they may require that, they're understanding that a 6-bus system in Watertown, South Dakota should have a different set, and its plan should look different than an urban operator with 300 buses. It was really great to see that, and that's really the kind of understanding and I think good partnership we need to see. Further, that NOFA included 25% of the low and no emission funds set aside for low emission vehicles. Battery electric buses are great for urban spaces. They're really only available in very big sizes. Smaller agencies need to move in that direction. You've mentioned some of the fueling that works in Minnesota. A lot of our members are using CNG, propane. Let's keep working towards that. This law comes at an ideal time for our membership. It really allows them to have the kind of investment they need to design and redesign their operations so that they can be as relevant as possible to the communities they're serving. They can take advantage of technological innovations, and they can work with new partners, both public and private, to really meet the needs. The essential equation in public transit is sometimes lost in these discussions. It's the trip, and it's the people. Folks like Ryan, they're not in the business of operating buses. They move people. Every day, our members connect isolated older adults with a healthy meal or a trip to the grocery store. We connect a patient 3 times a week with life-sustaining dialysis. We work with persons with disabilities to make sure they're getting essential job training. And we even sometimes are working with parents to attend visitations with a child placed in foster care, reducing the time it takes for that parent to reunify with their child. That's just some of the work our members do. Thanks for allowing me to tell their stories today, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Mr. Fegenbaum.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rounds, and fellow committee members, thank you for the ability to testify today. My name is Bart Fegenbaum. I am Senior Managing Director for Transportation Policy at Reason Foundation, a nonprofit think tank with offices in LA and DC. For almost 5 decades, Reason's transportation experts have advised federal, state, and local policymakers on market-based approaches to transportation. I'm a graduate of the Georgia Institute of Technology with degrees in public policy, transportation planning, and transportation engineering. Before working at Reason Foundation, I managed a van pool program in suburban Atlanta and handled transportation issues for former Representative Lynn Westmoreland. With Reason, I have offered research studies on policies that could improve urban and rural transit, as well as the effectiveness of infrastructure financing and funding. I have worked with more than a dozen states to implement transportation policy reform, and I serve on the Transportation Research Board, Bus Transit Systems, and Intelligent Transportation Systems Committee, as well as chairing the Bus Rapid Transit Subcommittee. Finally, I'm currently writing a book on how to create a 21st century transit system. My testimony today draws on these experiences. While much of the focus in the transit world is on providing mobility in urbanized area, not enough attention is paid to rural areas. More than 60 million people live in rural areas, and some of them rely on transit services to reach their jobs, doctors, and grocery stores. In the transit world, we distinguish between transit-dependent and transit-choice riders. Transit-dependent riders are those who do not have the means to access private vehicles. Transit-choice riders are those who do have the means but choose transit instead. Due to economic challenges in rural areas, a growing percentage of rural riders are transit dependent. Nationally, the average transit trip takes twice as long as driving, but in rural areas, the multiple is even greater. Since most rural transit riders are dependent on transit, my testimony is going to focus on those transit-dependent individuals. Obviously, transit service looks different in rural areas than in urban areas. While a heavy rail subway line makes sense for New York City and a bus rapid transit line makes sense for Atlanta, fixed route transit is seldom the best solution in rural areas. I have 5 recommendations for improving transit service to best serve rural populations. Recommendation number 1, right-sized transit vehicles to meet rural needs. While there may be some rural towns that can support a few fixed route bus lines, the better solution for rural municipalities is flexible options like demand response transit, where vehicles alter their services to meet riders' demands, and paratransit, which provide tailored services to people who are elderly or with disabilities. Several different types of vehicles are ideal for providing mobility in rural areas. The first vehicle type is a privately owned automobile, such as a ride-hail vehicle or taxi. Many rural areas have operated dial-a-ride taxi or Uber-like service for years. The second type of vehicle is a van that seats between 7 and 15 people. These vans are often used for van pools in urban area, but can operate as flexible minibuses in rural areas. Recommendation 2, contract out service or create a nonprofit to operate it. While the public service has been the traditional operator of transit services, my research has revealed that contracted transit services and services delivered by nonprofit agencies are better and cheaper than public service provision. With contracted services, the agency enters into a contract with an operator, such as First Transit or Transdev. These contracts can specify specific metrics to ensure accountability and results. For example, contracts can detail the maximum number of minutes a rider can be made to wait before being picked up, or the geographic locations of service that must be covered. Another possible model is having a nonprofit entity operate the service. Rural Transit Service, which operates in upstate New York, is a good model. In that case, the transit service southwest of Buffalo relies on a network of 130 volunteers to drive and maintain the vans, as well as handle administrative services. Most riders contribute money to their trips, but no riders are denied service for inability to pay. Recommendation number 3, reduce regulations. One of the challenges that rural transit agencies have is abiding by federal regulations. Some small counties, such as Randolph County, Georgia, have chosen not to offer transit service because officials say they cannot afford the staff needed to comply with regulations. To help reduce the burden on these rural systems, the The FTA in its National Transit Database recording should allow systems below a certain size to provide agency profile data, but not including the more rigorous data that is more time-consuming to collect. Congress could also eliminate costly mandates such as Buy America that drive up costs for local governments. And finally, the Department of Transportation has proposed amending 2132 AB 38 on charter service, regulation of buses and van pools, and 2132 AB 40 on bus testing. It's not clear what changes those regulations would have, but I would encourage committee members to pay attention. Recommendation number 4, try to improve efficiency. Rural transit services typically struggle to cover a small share of their cost. My colleague and I found that most systems had a fare box recovery rate of 5 to 25%, whereas urban systems have a fare box recovery rate of closer to 40%. Clearly, rural transit systems are always going to need to be subsidized, but looking at things such as a computerized dispatch center and ensuring that union contracts have flexibility will help decrease costs. Finally, recommendation number 5, focus more on local funding sources and less on federal sources. Funding is often the biggest challenge for rural transit systems. The recently passed IIJA provides a 29% increase in guaranteed federal transit funding to $91 billion over 5 years. There are also several grant programs, including a $2 billion rural transportation discretionary grant. However, my research finds local government funding is more important than federal funding because local officials know their communities best. State and local funding also comes on top of federal funding, providing a more robust resource share. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the need to improve rural transit services. I would be happy to answer any and all questions, either orally or in writing.
Thank you very much to all of our guests today. We'll now begin a round of 5-minute questions, and I will start and then hand it off to Senator Rounds. So each of you, in one way or another, have talked about how rural transit systems account for more than half of the nation's overall transit systems, and we know how important they are to communities, and they often don't get nearly the attention that they deserve given how important they are. Let me turn to Mr. Daniel and Mr. Bogren. So the passage of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act is going to help these transit systems to continue to serve. Can you both talk about what you see as the one or two most significant issues facing rural or small city transit systems right now, and how the Infrastructure and Jobs Act is going to assist? Mr. Daniel, you can start.
Well, rural systems throughout Minnesota need increased funding to make improvements to their services. Modernizing the buses with fleet would be number 1, and technological advances would be number 2. We always have to look for ways to enhance the customer experience. With the use of technology, that would be one way that we can enhance that customer experience. The use of mobile ticketing, smart apps, smart card systems, and also looking at modernizing the bus fleet or the vehicle fleet. If the buses are operating already with 250,000 miles, 9 out of 10, that bus might be in the shop more than it is on the road. Mm-hmm. So those would be the two. Those would be the two recommendations that I have. Would be look to modernize the fleet and also look at the technological advances because you want to make the ride-in public, the process seamless as possible.
Great.
And the use of technology will be very important in that aspect as well.
Thank you.
I think a lot of it was in the bill, the Rural Transit Act that both of you put forward last year. We need help with the local match. That's critical. And the other thing, you won't be surprised to hear, systems are having a really tough time finding drivers. Most of the operators that I talk to right now were not for the lack of having a full labor. They can't get back to their ridership levels pre-pandemic. They're hovering in the 60 to 70% recovered ridership, which is great, but they can do more and want to do more. So I would say it's those two issues right now. It's the local match, and it's the labor shortage.
Yep. Senator, I know that Senator Rounds and I both agree on the challenges around local match, and we tried hard to get that resolved in the bill, and we'll keep working on that. Let me ask you, whether we're hearing a lot about challenges around supply chains, and I'm wondering if either of you can address the issues around supply chains and how that's affecting maybe both amongst your members, your ability to be able to put these dollars to work.
Well, I think that's an issue. I've been doing this for 33 years. I never thought I'd see $1.5 billion in bus funding put out in a single notice of funding availability. And the irony is, many of the smaller agencies are telling me they're expecting a 48 plus month, maybe even a 3-year wait period before that new vehicle can get there. The vehicles that smaller agencies operate are oftentimes built on kind of an OEM chassis, like a Ford chassis. And understandably, the competition for those limited chassis is very high. So I'm concerned that it's going to take a while before we really start to see the impact of this capital investment out there in the field with new vehicles.
Mm-hmm. You saying the same thing, Mr. Daniel?
That's correct.
Yeah.
I'm seeing the same thing.
Now, I want to go to the question of workforce quickly. I know that small and rural transit providers in Minnesota tell me that the drivers' workforce issues are a really big deal. And it's not just drivers, it's also the dispatchers and office staff and all of the people that are required to make a system work. One provider told me about that if just 2 people call in sick on any given day, then they have to shut down the route. They can't just move people around. And of course, many rural transit providers rely heavily on volunteer drivers. There's a series of bureaucratic issues have made retaining those volunteer drivers really difficult. So, Mr. Bogren, can you talk about that briefly, and how can we in Congress help with that issue?
It again comes down to right sizing. There were movements in the development of the IIJA to move the threshold where you would need a CDL down to 8 passengers. It's currently at 16 plus the driver. That would have just meant these smaller agencies would have had to go out and find more CDL approved drivers. The FMCSA in February put out new rules on entry-level driving for CDL, getting that license. We need to make that simpler. Mm-hmm. The state of Minnesota is doing some really good work on that, by the way, in terms of training and developing regional approaches. Mm-hmm. We think that's going to be critical. That's one of the issues. And look, we're in an era of a lot of competition. We're competing for drivers, even with these smaller vehicles, with UPS and FedEx and Amazon, and we've got to come up with ways, whether they're apprenticeship programs and working with community colleges in the area, we've got to come up with some new ways to develop our workforce and bring them into what we do.
Thank you. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. According to the American Public Transportation Association, there are approximately 1,159 rural transit systems nationwide, accounting for more than half of the nation's transit systems. However, in most cases, rules and regulations are developed with a larger system in mind, creating compliance burdens for the truly small systems. And I know, Mr. Daniel, you mentioned that in your opening statement, and Mr. Feigenbaum, you've made it pretty clear that you think there are some modifications that need to be made as well. In terms of the current regulatory burden that small rural transit systems face, and the importance of keeping that burden as low as possible as we implement this act, Mr. Feigenbaum, can you begin by just sharing with us a few more, specifically the regulations that you think would be most effective that we should be looking at modifying or at least taking a second look at?
Sure. I believe that the most effective one would be the reporting in the National Transit Database. And just to clarify that a little bit further, right now, every transit agency has to report data on, I believe, something like 15 different categories, which takes a ton of staff time. It's reasonable to expect a transit system in New York or Los Angeles to do that, but I don't think a small transit system can do that. Small transit systems should just be allowed to provide the minimum amount of data that basically covers fare box recovery ratio, passengers, and the amount of funding they get in their budget each year. I think that would be plenty sufficient to ensure that the transit agencies are being a good steward of taxpayer dollars, but not be overly onerous. I also think the Buy America situation is pretty important. It really increases capital costs for transit vehicles by a lot, anywhere from 30 to 50%. It also increases the amount of time it takes to get those vehicles. So when a transit agency needs a vehicle, they are often relying on an older vehicle that has been mentioned may have 250,000 or more miles and not in the best shape, simply because it takes months and months and months to go through that. And there are some vehicles that are not even built in this country. And so the international company actually has to set up a factory in this country so they're compliant with Buy America. Finally, there's a lot of regulations that the Department of Transportation is proposing. The two that are pending right now, 2132 AB 38 and 2132 AB 40, on charter service regulation of buses and van pools and on bus testing, I don't know what's going to come out of them. They may be helpful. Generally, my opinion is that less is more in this type of situation. We should be focusing only on the regulations that are needed for safety and not on other purposes, whatever they might be. So those would be my top three.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Daniel, I know in your opening statement you commented on some of these issues. Would you concur with what Mr. Feigenbaum is suggesting?
Yes, I concur.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Bogren?
Yes, I think right-sizing regulations for the smaller agencies, it just makes a lot of sense. And when we think about things like electrifying vehicles, smaller communities in South Dakota, they should be working with the schools. They should be working with the municipal vehicles so they can increase their buying power and kind of work with these kind of regional approaches. Because when you're buying 2 or 3 vehicles, you don't have the same purchasing power. And it's just all the regulations just need to kind of be filtered through and understood that an agency that with the budget size and the staff size that a lot of my members have, it needs just to be right-sized.
Thank you. The elderly or disabled make up almost 1/3 of the population in rural communities and are often the two demographics within a community that need transportation services the most, whether to commute to a job, get to a doctor's appointment, or buy their groceries. They rely on paratransit services to get them safely to where they need to go. Mr. Bogren, could you discuss some of the unique transit challenges truly small rural communities like my own community of Pierre or Fort Pierre, South Dakota, face as they try to reach these individuals?
I learned a lot. I remember one time I was riding one of Barb Klein's buses out in the western part of South Dakota. And, we here on the East Coast, when we think about public transit, it's like, how do we get this person to their destination as absolutely fast as possible? That's the point. And you ride on rural vehicles with an older adult, and that may be their whole socializing for the day. And they don't actually mind if they get an extra half an hour on the vehicle to catch up with their neighbors. And the passengers, they know the drivers and vice versa. If that's a different driver, you'll get, oh, who's that? Where's Jerry, the person who's usually driving me? So, and that's a growing part of the population. And, there's nothing worse than the isolation that older adults face when they lose their mobility. I'm dealing with that personally with my own family right now, and trying to take the car keys away from my father is really hard because he views it as a diminished quality of life. These services stand in that and make their years fruitful still and very valuable.
I'll just share with you, my own father passed away in 2018, but a couple years before that, one of the difficult decisions we had was suggesting to Dad that it was time that he not drive, but it just happened to have been based upon me getting a phone call from the local transit driver who I knew, and he calls him, Mike, your dad just tried to make a left turn out of Burger King onto the highway again. It was not good. And but that once again, it's a case of where public transit is necessary in those small communities, and they really do make a difference. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Next, we will hear from Senator Ossoff, who is joining us remotely.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for hosting this hearing. Thank you to our panel. Mr. Bogren, in the last several years, communities across Georgia have embraced microtransit. Valdosta's new microtransit program is expected to average 170 riders, and this January completed close to 300 rides per day. The majority of these riders have a household income of $25,000 per year or less. And working with local leaders, I was recently able to secure an additional $1 million to expand the Valdosta on-demand microtransit fleet. With the increased funding through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Mr. Bogren, how do you see microtransit transforming transit service for small cities like Valdosta, Georgia, and rural communities over the next 5 years?
Well, what it will do is it will provide an entirely new way to serve areas. Typically, we kind of, a city the size of Valdosta would have had fixed route service, maybe operating buses at an hour headway. And what the on-demand model is proving in Valdosta is it can increase service, serve more people, and do it at a lower cost. And we view that as a very important model that we want to see all sorts of other communities investing in and trying. And it's a place where we can partner with the private sector and also where we can onboard the kind of technology that really makes the service more relevant to a passenger than what we have often done in communities that size, which is the bare minimum when it comes to a fixed route service.
Thank you, Mr. Bogren. In Georgia, 36 of our 159 counties still have no access to any public transportation. In my view, this is an unacceptable lack of access to transportation. We just heard from my Republican colleague, Senator Rounds. There's bipartisan support for transit in rural communities. That's one of the reasons I authored the Local Transit Planning Support Act, which empowers the federal government to provide more help to low density and low income communities as they plan their transportation networks. And that legislation was signed into law by President Biden as part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Mr. Bogren, how can communities without public transportation networks like Harris County in the Chattahoochee River Valley, Newton County in Metro Atlanta, or, for example, Houston County in Central Georgia, take advantage of the Local Transit Planning Support Act to begin planning and implementing transit services in their own communities?
Well, I think the planning is critical. And, rural areas are now more kind of economic regions than they are isolated, self-contained little towns. And in the counties that are unserved in Georgia, we need to bring those counties together to look at what are the big trip generators and what are the big important destinations, healthcare, higher ed, obviously work and other those types of environments. And that kind of planning that you've built in there is exactly what needs to take place. And we also need to make sure, cognizant of what Senator Rounds said earlier, that, and we really believe that people with disabilities and older adults need to be a part of that planning process. We need inclusive planning because the services are often targeting and built for them, and yet we don't sometimes in the planning process involve them in that service.
Thank you, Mr. Bogren. And we can look as well at rural areas with significant manufacturing presence where workers need to be able to get to and from work, to and from the store, to and from the doctor, as building regional authorities who can engage in this planning together. We're looking at some possibilities for that in West Georgia. Mr. Daniel, I want to discuss paratransit with you. High quality public transportation means more than just regular buses and trains. It's an integral public service. Communities across Georgia are looking to improve their paratransit services. In Chatham County, for example, in coastal Georgia, there are plans to build a new paratransit maintenance facility, allowing Chatham area transit to provide ADA-compliant transit services while increasing efficiency and reliability. How do you see the increased resources through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law serving the expansion and improvement of paratransit services, for example, in Chatham County and the broader ADA community, please?
With the use of the federal funds, higher quality public transit service, we have to focus on the areas of technology, safety, security, delivering service, and new buses. With the technology, this includes real-time bus updates for our customers, mobile ticketing, mobile apps, and smart fare cards. This will help provide customers with convenient transportation and position public transit as a whole as a legitimate option for travel. These improvements enhance the customer experience and enables increased independence for community members who may otherwise be homebound or reliant on family and friends to get to work or medical appointments. In terms of safety, touchless fare payment reduces physical interaction between the bus operators and customers, thereby protecting both groups, especially during the flu and COVID seasons. In terms of security, comprehensive camera systems will help ensure customers and employees are confident.
Okay, Mr. Daniel, I'm sorry, my time is going to expire in a moment. I wanted to focus on paratransit there, but with the chair's forgiveness, I'm just going to ask one more question, Mr. Bogren. This bipartisan infrastructure law is a tremendous opportunity to invest in public transportation in fast-growing communities like Augusta, Georgia, home to Fort Gordon, the Cyber Center of Excellence, and Augusta University Medical Center. What opportunities do you see, Mr. Bogren, for cities like Augusta who have, for example, that high-tech and military footprint and are growing to invest in forward-leaning technologies that keep up with changing and growing demand?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunities to do that. I can't tell you how many of our members have military veterans in the operations environment because they're used to that environment and they're used to working with technology. And there's a lot of them coming on board right now. For instance, we've done a lot of talking here about on-demand, but there's no reason that what we're learning in Valdosta can't be applied in the Augusta part of your state and looked at. Granted, each community is unique, but some of the operational environments that are out there, the ability now to pay for technology, buy vehicles, and really pay for capital to make these things happen has never been greater, and we need to make that work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bogren. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. I believe that Senator Rounds doesn't have any additional questions, so I'm just going to ask one final question directed to Mr. Bogren, and this has to do with tribal transit. I'd love to just talk about that briefly. Senator Rounds and I both sit on the Indian Affairs Committee, and I know also that the Infrastructure and Jobs Act provided massive increases in funding for FTA's tribal transit program. And of course, transit in Indian country is just as vital as it is in any other rural community, in some ways almost more so. So could you just comment briefly on what impact this will have on tribal transit and what we need to be keeping in mind on this committee there?
Well, tribal communities are very unique communities. I've worked with them in both Minnesota and South Dakota. But, you know, the need is there. It's desperate, and the growth that the bill provides is so needed. We were meeting with a bunch of tribes last week up in Alaska with some of my staff, and you know what they can do now, because there were so many tribes competing for a fixed amount through the FAST Act. This amount, great growth, and also it grows throughout the 5 years in this bill. We know this program is going to be oversubscribed. It always is. And that's because the tribes have health care needs. They have jobs and commute transportation needs. And they have to do it in often very isolated rural communities where if they don't transport their tribal members, no one will.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to just say thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today and for your testimony. I think we have heard a clear message about the importance of understanding the unique needs of small rural transit providers. We heard great messages about how we need to right-size our regulations, our vehicles, how we need to be thinking about using these dollars to help modernize systems, increase technology in these systems, and also, as we've said, address some of the challenges around drivers that we're seeing everywhere, not only in transit. So I want to thank you very much. I hope to work more with you, Senator Rounds, on these issues facing rural transit providers and operators, and to continue to push our Investments in Rural Transit Act. And I'm sure that we'll be able to find other ways to help out rural and small transit providers as we implement this legislation in a good bipartisan way. Before we adjourn, I'd like to just enter into the record a letter from the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials with recommendations for implementation of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. Without objection, so ordered. And for any senator who wishes to submit questions for the record, those questions are due 1 week from today, which will be Wednesday, April 13th. For our witnesses, you have a 45-day period to respond to those questions for the record, and thank you again for participating. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.